It's a warm evening in Atlanta this past spring, and a fresh poll lands in newsrooms across the state. A sitting United States Senator, a man who won his seat by the narrowest of margins back in a runoff that the entire country watched, is now sitting on a lead of just over 2 points against the man the president's own party has chosen to try to take that seat away from him. 2 points. In a state that, by the numbers, is about as evenly split as any state in the country. On the surface, this looks like just another midterm horse race story, the kind that political junkies obsess over and everyone else tunes out. But if you look closer, and I mean really look, it tells you something about where this country actually stands right now. Heading into a midterm election that could flip the balance of power in Washington entirely. And most people watching didn't realize how close this race really is, because the easy headlines either declare it a lock for one side or treat it as an afterthought next to flashier contests. Neither one is telling you the truth. This touches who controls the United States Senate for the next 2 years. It touches whether the current administration gets a rubber stamp or a real check on its power. And it touches the kind of country your grandkids inherit, because Senate majorities decide judges, decide budgets, and decide whether the executive branch operates with restraint or without it. So let's talk about it. And here's the thread I want you to hold on to, because we will come back to it. This same senator already won an election decided by less than 0.2%, the closest statewide result of its kind in modern memory. Hold on to that number, because it tells you exactly how this race is likely to end. And we'll come back to it before we're through tonight. There's a second thing I want you to keep in your pocket too. Right now, prediction markets, the places where people put real money behind their political bets, have this race pegged at roughly an 80% chance of the incumbent holding on. That's a strong lead. But it is not, and I want to stress this, anything close to a sure thing. We'll come back to what that gap between favored and certain actually means. To understand tonight, you've got to understand how we got here, because the chain of events matters, and this story doesn't start with this year's polling. It starts 6 years ago. Back in that earlier cycle, a young first-time candidate ran for the Senate in Georgia and forced the race into a runoff after neither candidate cleared 50% of the vote in November. That runoff, held in the dead of a Georgia winter, with the entire country's attention fixed on it because control of the Senate hung in the balance, ended in one of the closest statewide results anyone in modern political history had ever seen. He won, barely. And he became, at the time, the youngest member of the United States Senate, a Democrat representing a state that had voted Republican in presidential elections for a generation before that. He spent those 6 years doing something that doesn't always make headlines, but matters enormously in a closely divided state. Building a reputation as someone willing to break from his own party on specific votes while still delivering for Democratic priorities when it counted. That kind of positioning is exactly what you need in a state this evenly split, and it's exactly why This race, 6 years later, is shaping up to be a rerun of that same nail-biter. And every decision echoes for years. What we're watching now is the echo of a choice Georgia voters made 6 years ago by the narrowest of margins. And the question this November is whether that same coalition holds together one more time under very different national conditions than the ones that produced it the first time. Let me be precise, because the details matter more than anybody's spin. The president's party went through a contested primary process to pick a challenger, and ultimately the president's own preferred pick, a sitting member of the House of Representatives, won out over a rival backed by the state's sitting Republican governor, a former college football coach turned state government figure. That intra-party fight matters because it tells you the National Party leadership wanted a particular kind of challenger, one more closely aligned with the administration's brand, rather than a candidate built around the governor's more institutional establishment Republican network. According to the Real Clear Politics polling average, the incumbent currently holds roughly a 2.5-point lead over that challenger. Compare that to earlier matchups in the same cycle against other potential Republican opponents, where his lead was measured at 3.5 to 6 points, depending on who he was facing. In other words, this specific matchup against this specific opponent is the tightest version of this race on the board right now. That's not an accident. The challenger the president's party ultimately settled on is by design a closer ideological match to the current political moment in Georgia than some of his primary rivals were. And that closer match appears to be translating into a tighter contest on paper. Layer onto that the broader national environment, because no Senate race exists in a vacuum. Generic congressional ballot polling currently shows Democrats ahead by roughly 4.5 to 5 points nationally, a swing of more than 7 points compared to the Republican advantage on that same measure just 2 years earlier. Midterm elections, as a matter of historical record going back decades, tend to break against whichever party holds the White House. And that generic ballot number is one of the clearest early signals of which direction the political wind is blowing this particular cycle. And there's a second statewide race on the same ballot worth knowing about because it shapes turnout in ways that ripple straight into this Senate contest. Georgia also holds a gubernatorial election this cycle with a crowded Republican primary field that in early polling showed a businessman with no prior elected office holding a surprising early lead over both the sitting lieutenant governor and the Secretary of State. The pollsters were quick to caution that early leads in crowded primaries often reflect simple name recognition rather than durable, lasting support once voters start paying closer attention. On the Democratic side, an experienced former mayor of Atlanta looks well positioned to win her party's nomination outright. A high-profile, well-funded governor's race sitting on the very same ballot drives turnout in ways that ripple directly into the Senate contest listed just above it. Now let me put my analyst hat on for a few minutes because the strategy here is genuinely worth examining closely. What you're watching is a campaign built almost entirely around a single, deceptively simple question. Can an incumbent who won by 2001% assemble that same fragile coalition one more time in a midterm year where his party out of the White House typically benefits against an opponent handpicked by a president who remains deeply popular with the base, but whose broader national approval has frayed noticeably at the edges over the past year? The incumbent's strategy, from everything visible in the public record, leans heavily on that history of selective independence, votes where he broke from his own party, framed not as betrayal, but as evidence that he represents Georgia first and his party second. That's a deliberate, calculated appeal to the same suburban split-ticket voters who gave him his razor-thin margin the first time around. Voters who may lean conservative on plenty of individual issues, but were uncomfortable enough with the alternative 6 years ago to cross over and vote against their usual party. The challenger's strategy leans just as heavily in the opposite direction on nationalizing the race entirely, tying the incumbent to his party's national leadership and to specific votes that polled poorly with Georgia's more conservative-leaning electorate, betting that a midterm environment hostile to the party and the White House still won't be enough to overcome a powerful national headwind if local Republican turnout holds firm on its own. So who actually benefits from a low turnout, low drama campaign here? Ask yourself that honestly. Generally, in a race already this close, the side with the deeper, more energized base benefits most from depressed turnout, while the side relying more heavily on crossover and genuinely independent voters needs higher overall participation to win comfortably. That dynamic alone tells you why you're going to see an enormous amount of money spent on get-out-the-vote operations rather than pure persuasion advertising. As we get closer to November, here's the lagging indicator that matters most. The one campaign strategist watched closer than almost any single poll. Fundraising data released this spring showed Democrats gaining ground not just in Georgia, but across several of the most competitive Senate races nationally, including in Alaska, North Carolina, and Texas. Money doesn't guarantee victory by itself, but a fundraising advantage this broad, spread across multiple states at once rather than concentrated in just one, tells you something genuinely structural is shifting in the national political environment, not just in one isolated idiosyncratic race. Now, I want to be fair here, because this isn't about one party, and it never really is in a race this close. The incumbent's own party should be honest about the fact that an 80% favorite in a prediction market is still a candidate who loses one time in 5. And overconfidence has cost Democrats winnable Senate seats in past cycles when campaigns and donors treated a comfortable lead as a foregone conclusion rather than a fragile advantage. That required continued investment and continued vigilance all the way through to Election Day itself. And let me say something my own side won't necessarily want to hear. nationalizing every single midterm race around the president, win or lose, has its limits as a long-term strategy for the party out of power, because it can flatten out genuinely talented, locally popular candidates into interchangeable proxies for a national fight. When voters in states like Georgia have shown repeatedly and consistently that they're perfectly willing to split their tickets and vote for the individual over the party label, if given an honest reason to do so, the fair-minded read here is that both parties are, in their own way, betting on the exact same underlying assumption that this race comes down to turnout mechanics and candidate quality far more than it comes down to any single piece of national news cycle drama. That's a sober way to look at it, and it's the same lens worth applying to every other competitive Senate race on the map this cycle, regardless of which party you're rooting for. Now, stay with me, because here's the part that actually matters most. The two threads I asked you to hold on to earlier. Remember that 0.2% margin from 6 years ago. That number isn't ancient history sitting in a dusty file somewhere. It's the most reliable single data point we have for how tightly balanced this particular electorate really is, regardless of what any individual poll says in any given month. And remember that 80% prediction market figure too, because the gap between heavily favored and guaranteed is exactly the space where upsets happen in American politics, especially in a state that has delivered razor-thin statewide results, election after election, for the better part of a decade now. So here's where I think it's heading, and I see three roads from here, and I want to be honest with you about all of them, including the one I find